Olivia Knight had always been a creature of habit. Her routine was an anchor in the chaotic storm of her work as an FBI agent. But tonight, that sense of stability felt like a distant memory. As she sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of the city outside barely registered in her mind. Her world had narrowed to the case file spread before her, the empty cup of coffee forgotten at her elbow, and the photograph she couldn't stop staring at. Douglas Westray. His name was still plastered across the news, his disappearance a hot topic on every media outlet. But even with all the attention, all the speculation, no one had any real answers. Not yet. Westray, a high-profile businessman with ties to politicians, corporate heads, and even international players, had vanished without a trace. And it was Olivia's job to find out why. She flipped the photo over, glancing at the notes she'd scribbled hastily earlier that day. Every lead she'd followed, every person she'd interviewed, it all felt like she was chasing shadows. But she knew better than to give in to frustration. In her line of work, patience was as much a weapon as her sidearm. With a sigh, Olivia leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The late hour weighed heavily on her, and the exhaustion from days of sleepless nights was starting to creep in. But she knew sleep wouldn't come easily tonight, not with so many unanswered questions swirling in her mind. She stood, pacing her small apartment, her thoughts racing. There was something off about this case, something that went deeper than a simple disappearance. Westray wasn't just any man. He was the kind of person who knew things people would kill to keep secret. And that made his disappearance more than just a missing person case. It was something far more dangerous. Olivia's gut twisted with the familiar feeling of unease. She trusted that feeling. It had saved her more times than she could count. And right now, it was screaming at her that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, Olivia arrived at FBI headquarters, the familiar buzz of activity barely registering as she made her way through the bullpen. Agents moved through the space, phones ringing, papers shuffling, but her focus was singular. She had an appointment, an interview with one of Westray's closest associates, Thomas Chetwynd. Thomas was one of those men who exuded confidence, almost to the point of arrogance. A high-ranking executive at Westray's company, he had been one of the last people to see Westray before his disappearance. Olivia didn't trust him. She could see it in the way he carried himself, the way his answers had been just a little too polished during their previous meetings. Olivia walked into the interrogation room, finding Thomas already seated at the sleek, metallic table, his fingers drumming impatiently against the surface. He gave her a tight-lipped smile as she sat across from him, the overhead light casting sharp shadows across his face. "Agent Knight." He greeted her with a nod, his voice smooth. "Too smooth." "Mr. Chetwynd," Olivia replied, her tone neutral. She pulled out her notepad, flipping it open as she settled in. "I appreciate you coming back in. I just have a few follow-up questions." Thomas shrugged, leaning back in his chair with an air of nonchalance. "Of course. Always happy to help. But I already told you everything I know." Olivia raised an eyebrow, her pen tapping lightly against the notepad. "Yes, you've been very cooperative, but some new information has come to light, and I wanted to clarify a few things." She watched his expression closely, noting the brief flicker of something in his eyes. It was there for only a second, but it was enough. He was hiding something. "You mentioned before that you and Westray had a business meeting the day before he disappeared," Olivia said, her gaze steady. "Can you tell me more about what was discussed during that meeting?" Thomas's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Just business as usual. Nothing out of the ordinary. Olivia didn't blink. You also mentioned that Westray seemed distracted, worried even. Thomas hesitated, his fingers stilling on the table. Yes, well, he had a lot on his plate. The business was under a lot of pressure. It wasn't unusual for him to be stressed. Stressed about what? Olivia pressed. Thomas shifted in his seat, his confidence wavering just enough for Olivia to catch it. You know how it is, Agent Knight. Running a company like that isn't easy. There are always challenges. Olivia leaned forward slightly, her voice low. Challenges like what? Financial troubles? Legal issues? Thomas's jaw tightened. Look, I don't know what you're getting at, but I already told you. Then why did Westray have a private conversation with his lawyer just hours before he disappeared? Olivia cut in, her gaze locked on his. Thomas froze, his eyes widening just enough to betray his surprise. Olivia had him. She didn't need him to say anything. His reaction said it all. I wasn't aware of that, Thomas muttered, his voice a little too casual. Olivia didn't respond immediately. She let the silence hang between them, the tension thick in the air. She wanted him to squirm, to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. You've been very helpful, Mr. Chetwynd, she said finally, her voice calm. But if I find out you're withholding information, things are going to get a lot more difficult for you. Thomas didn't say anything as Olivia stood, collecting her things. She could feel his eyes on her as she left the room, and she knew he was calculating his next move. But she didn't care. She had what she needed, confirmation that Westray had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone realized. Later that day, Olivia found herself back in Westray's office, retracing her steps. The polished floors gleamed under the sunlight that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the entire place felt sterile, almost too perfect. But Olivia knew better. She knew that perfection was often a mask for chaos, and in Westray's world, chaos was an inevitability. She knelt down beside the desk, her eyes scanning the floor, her fingers brushing the edges of the polished wood. There, tucked beneath the edge, was a small folded piece of paper, almost invisible against the dark grain of the wood. Olivia's heart skipped a beat as she carefully pulled it free. The paper was old, its edges yellowed and fragile, as though it had been hidden away for years. Olivia unfolded it, her eyes scanning the faded ink. The words were cryptic, but it didn't take long for Olivia to realize what she was holding. It was a letter, one that hinted at a secret meeting, a deal made in the shadows, something that Westray had been involved in just before his disappearance. Olivia's mind raced as she pieced together the implications. Westray hadn't just disappeared. He had been silenced, and this letter was proof. Someone had wanted him out of the way, someone powerful enough to make him vanish without a trace. The air in the office felt heavy as Olivia stood, her pulse quickening. She needed to move fast. Whoever was behind this wouldn't wait long before covering their tracks, and she couldn't afford to lose any more time. Back at headquarters, Olivia's fingers flew over the keyboard as she pulled up every file she could find on Westray's associates, connections, and business dealings. The deeper she dug, the more complicated the web became. Every lead seemed to branch into a dozen more, each one more tangled than the last. But Olivia had been here before. She knew that untangling this mess was the only way to get to the truth. Hours passed, the sun setting outside the windows of her office, as Olivia worked tirelessly, her mind buzzing with the details of the case. The phone calls, the meetings, the documents. It all pointed to one thing: a conspiracy. Westray had known something dangerous, and it had cost him his life. But Olivia wasn't going to let that be the end of the story. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but there was still one thing missing, one crucial detail that would tie it all together, and Olivia knew exactly where to find it. The next morning, Olivia found herself standing outside the headquarters of the Nugent Corporation, a towering skyscraper that loomed over the city like a monument to power and wealth. The building's glass facade reflected the clouds overhead, giving it an almost ethereal quality. But Olivia knew better. She knew that behind those walls, deals were being made, secrets were being kept, and lives were being destroyed. She entered the building, the cool air hitting her as she made her way through the sleek lobby. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm, composed. This was it, the moment she had been working toward for weeks. Olivia had managed to secure a meeting with the CEO of the Nugent Corporation, Leonard Nugent himself. He was a man of immense power, with connections that reached far beyond the business world. Olivia knew that if anyone had answers, it was him. As she sat in the plush office, waiting for Nugent to arrive, Olivia's mind raced with possibilities. She had gone over the evidence 100 times, pieced together the puzzle as best she could. But there was still so much she didn't know, so much that was hidden in the shadows. She needed to be careful. One wrong move, and this entire investigation could collapse. When Nugent finally entered the room, he was every bit as imposing as Olivia had imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence that seemed to fill the space. He greeted her with a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Agent Knight," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "I understand you've been looking into some unfortunate events." Olivia shook his hand, her expression neutral. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Douglas Westray. I believe you might have some information that could help." Nugent's smile didn't falter, but Olivia could see the tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He was used to controlling the narrative, used to having the upper hand. But Olivia wasn't about to let him steer this conversation. "I understand Westray had dealings with your company," Olivia continued, her voice steady. "Care to shed some light on that?" Nugent sat down behind his massive desk, his fingers steepling as he regarded her. "Mr. Westray was a business associate, yes, but I fail to see how that's relevant to your investigation." Olivia leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. "It's relevant because Westray didn't just disappear. He was silenced, and I have reason to believe that your company played a role in that." The silence that followed was deafening. Nugent's smile vanished, his expression hardening as he stared at Olivia. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "I don't know what you think you've uncovered, Agent Knight," Nugent said finally, his voice cold. "But I assure you, you're making a mistake." Olivia didn't blink. "The only mistake I've made is not coming here sooner." Nugent's eyes flashed with anger, but he quickly regained his composure. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." Olivia stood, gathering her things. "I think I have a pretty good idea. And trust me, this isn't over." As she left the building, Olivia's mind raced. She had rattled Nugent, that much was clear. But she also knew that he was far from finished. The game was only just beginning, and Olivia was prepared for the long fight ahead. Back at headquarters, Olivia sat at her desk, staring at the stack of files before her. She had managed to pull together enough evidence to expose the conspiracy, but there were still so many unanswered questions. She knew that Nugent and his associates would stop at nothing to protect themselves, and that made her next move even more dangerous. She took a deep breath, pushing the files aside as she stood. There was one more person she needed to speak to, someone who had been on the periphery of the investigation, always just out of reach. Someone who held the final piece of the puzzle. Olivia walked through the crowded streets of the city, her mind focused on the task ahead. She had spent weeks chasing leads, unraveling the conspiracy bit by bit. Now, she was ready to confront the one person who could bring it all crashing down. When she arrived at the modest apartment building, Olivia hesitated for just a moment before knocking on the door. She knew that what happened next would change everything. The door opened slowly, revealing a familiar face, Freddie Pilkington Soames, Westray's lawyer. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of whatever secrets he had been keeping. But Olivia wasn't here for sympathy. "Freddie," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Freddie nodded, stepping aside to let her in. The apartment was small, cluttered with papers and books, the smell of old coffee lingering in the air. Olivia took a seat on the worn couch, watching as Freddie sat across from her, his hands trembling slightly. "I didn't want any of this to happen," Freddie began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know it would go this far." Olivia's gaze didn't waver. "But you knew something. You knew enough to keep quiet." Freddie's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Olivia thought he might break down. But he held it together, taking a deep breath before speaking again. "I tried to warn him," Freddie said, his voice shaking. "I told him that he was in too deep, that these people, they weren't like us. They don't play by the same rules." Olivia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Who are they? Who's behind all of this?" Freddie shook his head, his eyes filled with fear. I can't say. They'll kill me. They'll kill you." Olivia's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let the fear show. "Freddie, if you don't tell me everything you know, more people will die. Westray's already gone. Don't let his death be in vain." Freddie was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the floor. Olivia could see the internal battle he was waging, the fear, the guilt, the uncertainty. But she knew that he was her only hope of bringing this conspiracy to light. Finally, Freddie spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just one person. It's a group, a network. They control everything, the businesses, the politicians, the media. They can make people disappear, make entire lives vanish, like they never existed." Olivia's mind raced as she processed what Freddie was saying. She had suspected that the conspiracy was larger than it appeared, but this was something else entirely. A shadowy network of power brokers, operating behind the scenes, manipulating events to suit their own ends. "Who's at the top?" Olivia asked, her voice steady. Freddie hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the door, as though he expected someone to burst in at any moment. "Nugent," he said finally. "Leonard Nugent. He's the one pulling the strings." Olivia's pulse quickened. Nugent. She had known he was involved, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down her spine. She had rattled him during their meeting, but now she knew just how deep his involvement went. Freddie leaned forward, his voice urgent. "You have to be careful, Agent Knight. These people, They don't leave loose ends. Olivia stood, her mind racing. She had what she needed. The pieces were finally coming together, and now it was time to act. As she left Freddie's apartment, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over her. She knew that exposing Nugent and his network would be dangerous, but she also knew that it was the only way to bring justice to the people who had been silenced. The streets were dark and quiet as Olivia made her way back to headquarters, her mind focused on the task ahead. She had spent weeks unraveling the conspiracy, and now she was ready to bring it all crashing down. But as she approached her car, Olivia's instincts kicked in. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the sense of being watched, of danger lurking just out of sight. Her hand moved to her sidearm, her eyes scanning the shadows as she quickened her pace. She had been careful, but she knew that Nugent's people were always one step ahead, and now they were closing in. A figure emerged from the alleyway, moving quickly toward her. Olivia's heart raced as she drew her weapon, her voice steady but firm. "Stop right there." The figure froze, hands raised in surrender. But as they stepped into the light, Olivia's breath caught in her throat. It was Thomas Chetwynd. "You don't understand," Thomas said, his voice panicked. "You have no idea what's really going on." Olivia's grip tightened on her weapon, her mind racing. "Then tell me." Thomas hesitated, his eyes darting around as though searching for an escape. But Olivia didn't waver. "You have to stop," Thomas said, his voice desperate. "If you keep going, they'll come for you. They'll destroy everything." Olivia took a step forward, her voice low. "Who's they?" Thomas's eyes filled with fear, and for a moment Olivia thought he might bawl. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The network. Nugent's not the only one. There are others, people you'd never expect. They're everywhere. They control everything." Olivia's mind raced as she processed what Thomas was saying. The conspiracy was even bigger than she had imagined, and now she was caught in the middle of it. "Why are you telling me this?" Olivia asked, her voice steady. Thomas swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to the shadows. "Because I don't want to die." Olivia lowered her weapon slightly, her eyes locked on his. "Then help me bring them down." For a long moment, Thomas didn't move. But then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll help," he said quietly. "But you need to know they'll come for you. And when they do, you need to be ready." Olivia nodded, her mind already racing with plans. She knew that taking down a network this powerful would be the fight of her life, but she was ready for it. As she watched Thomas disappear into the shadows, Olivia couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The battle ahead would be long and dangerous, but she had come too far to turn back now. The truth was out there, and Olivia Knight wasn't about to stop until she brought it to light. The cold wind whipped through Olivia Knight's hair as she stood on the rooftop of a high-rise, the city lights shimmering in the distance. Her mind was racing, the events of the last few days blurring together in a haze of tension, betrayal, and revelations. Thomas Chetwynd had given her the final piece of the puzzle, the existence of a shadowy network, far more powerful than she had ever imagined. And now, she was going to expose it. But she wasn't naive. She knew the risks. This wasn't just an ordinary case. It was a battle against people who held the reins of power. They were everywhere, in the government, in business, in law enforcement, and they would do anything to keep their secrets hidden. Olivia had no illusions about how dangerous this was. but she also knew she had no choice. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Freddie Pilkington Soames. "They know, Olivia." His voice trembled on the other end. "They know what you're planning. You have to be careful. They'll come for you. I'm counting on it," Olivia said, her voice steady. "I'm not running, Freddie. Not this time." Freddie was silent for a moment, and Olivia could feel the weight of his fear pressing through the phone. "You don't understand. They've been watching you. They know everything. They've planted people in your office, in your team." Olivia's heart pounded. This was worse than she thought, but she couldn't back down now. "I know, Freddie," she said quietly, "but I have what I need. It's all ready. I'm taking them down." She hung up before he could respond, slipping the phone back into her pocket. She knew what she had to do. She had secured a trove of evidence, documents, audio recordings, witness statements that would blow the entire conspiracy wide open, and she was going to deliver it where the whole world would see. Her plan was simple. She was going to make sure the truth couldn't be buried. She had set up a meeting at a public location, where she would confront the head of the network, Leonard Nugent, and give him one final chance to come clean. But Olivia knew he wouldn't. Men like Nugent didn't confess. They controlled, they manipulated, and they destroyed anyone who got in their way. But not this time. Olivia made her way down to the street, the weight of the evidence pressing against her like a physical force. Every step brought her closer to the inevitable confrontation, her mind running through every possible outcome. She had a plan, but plans could go wrong, and if they did, she would need to be ready. The cafe where the meeting was set was busy, a perfect cover. Olivia sat at the table near the back, her eyes scanning the crowd. She was prepared. The moment she walked in, she had notified her contacts in the press. If anything happened to her, if she didn't make it out of here, everything would be released. The world would know. Minutes passed. She checked her watch, feeling the tension in her body tighten with every second. And then she saw him. Leonard Nugent entered the cafe with the confidence of a man who had never known fear. He was dressed impeccably, his sharp suit cutting through the casual ambience of the cafe like a knife. His eyes locked on Olivia as he made his way toward her, a cold, calculating look in his gaze. He sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. "You've been busy, Agent Knight," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "I assume you have a reason for dragging me into this." Quaint little setting. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "I have everything I need, Nugent. Every dirty deal, every payoff, every disappearance. It's over." Nugent's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he simply watched her, his expression betraying nothing. "You think you've won?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with amusement. "You think you've uncovered something new? You've only scratched the surface, Olivia. There's so much more that you'll never understand." Olivia felt a cold shiver run down her spine, but she didn't let it show. "You've been pulling the strings for too long, Nugent, but it ends now. I've already sent everything to the press. If I don't walk out of here, the world will know what you've done." Nugent chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You think that matters? You think the press can stop this? We control the press. We control everything. You're just one woman, Olivia. One agent in a world you can't possibly comprehend. Olivia's hand tightened around the edge of the table. You underestimate me, Nugent. And you underestimate the people who want justice. You might control the press, but you can't control the truth. Not this time. For the first time, Nugent's expression faltered, a flicker of doubt passing through his eyes. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You think you're safe. You're not. You've already lost. You just don't know it yet. Olivia's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. If I've lost, why are you here? Nugent didn't answer. Instead, he stood, adjusting his suit jacket with a practiced ease. This isn't over, Olivia. You'll learn that soon enough. He turned to leave, but Olivia's voice stopped him in his tracks. It's already over, Nugent, she said, standing. Because the truth is out there now, and no matter how powerful you are, you can't stop it. Nugent paused, his back to her, but he didn't turn around. After a moment, he walked out of the cafe without another word, disappearing into the crowd. Olivia sat back down, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had confronted the man at the top, the one pulling the strings, and she had come out the other side alive. But she knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The next few days were a blur. As Olivia predicted, the moment her evidence hit the press, the media erupted in a frenzy. Headlines screamed of corruption, cover-ups, and conspiracies at the highest levels of power. Lennon Nugent's name was everywhere, and the world's attention was fixed on him and his network of elites who had operated in the shadows for so long. Olivia's phone rang non-stop. Reporters, government officials, even other FBI agents who had been kept in the dark about the case wanted to know more. She gave a few statements, but mostly she stayed in the background, letting the evidence speak for itself. The public was outraged, demanding justice. Protests erupted across the country, calling for the resignation of every official linked to the scandal. The walls were closing in on Nugent and his associates, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. But Olivia knew that bringing down a man like Nugent wouldn't happen overnight. He had too many connections, too much influence. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they had a chance. The truth was out there now, and the people who had been hiding in the shadows were being dragged into the light. Weeks passed, and the investigations continued. Arrests were made, deals were struck, and more information about the network came to light. Nugent's empire was crumbling, piece by piece, and Olivia watched it all unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done her part. She had exposed the truth, and now it was up to the system to bring the guilty to justice. But Olivia wasn't naive. She knew there would be more battles ahead. Nugent's network wasn't just a group of individuals. It was a system, a structure that had been built over decades, and tearing it down would take time. Still, as she sat in her apartment one evening, watching the news coverage of the latest developments in the case, Olivia allowed herself a moment of peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had made a difference. A few weeks later, Olivia found herself back at FBI headquarters, her office filled with boxes of case files and personal items. She had decided to take a step back, to reassess her future. The case had taken its toll on her, both physically and emotionally, and she needed time to process everything that had happened. As she packed up the last of her things, there was a knock at the door. She turned to see Freddie Pilkington Soames standing in the doorway, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "Leaving already?" Freddie asked, a small smile on his face. Olivia chuckled, closing the box she had been packing. Just taking a break. I think I've earned it. Freddie nodded, stepping into the office. You did it, Olivia. You took them down. Olivia shook her head. We're not done yet. There's still more work to do. Freddie leaned against the desk, his smile fading slightly. Yeah, but you're not doing it alone anymore. Olivia met his gaze, a sense of relief washing over her. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As she closed the door behind her and walked out of the building, Olivia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had fought the fight, exposed the truth, and now, for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful for the future. The world was still full of secrets, full of corruption and darkness. But Olivia Knight knew she was ready for whatever came next, because the truth had power, and as long as she was there to fight for it, justice would prevail.